The entire golden age of piracy lasted about 30 years and involved roughly 5,000 people. 30 years, 5,000 humans. That sliver of time and that handful of sailors produced every pirate image you carry in your head. The skull flag, the treasure map, the plank, the parrot, the accent, all of it. The actual history of piracy covers 3,000 years, touches 6 continents, and involves millions of lives destroyed, traded, ransomed, and drowned. We memorized the wrong chapter and skipped the rest of the book. So let us fix that, starting about 32 centuries ago on the coast of Egypt, where the oldest recorded navy in the world was about to fight one of the oldest recorded naval battles against an enemy that, to this day, nobody can fully identify. Around 1178 BC, a confederation of raiders the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples smashed into the eastern Mediterranean like a fist through wet paper. We know their group names from the hieroglyphic inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, the Peleset, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Veshesh. The inscriptions say their own lands were destroyed, that no country could stand before their arms. For a long time, historians blamed them for the Bronze Age collapse, the simultaneous implosion of every major civilization, from Greece to Mesopotamia, around 1200 BC. The Mycenaeans, gone. The Hittite Empire, erased. Ugarit, burned to rubble. The old theory was clean. Foreign invaders rolled in and broke everything. The old theory was also mostly wrong. Eric Klein, in his 2014 book 1177 BC, assembled the evidence for a system's collapse, a perfect storm of drought, earthquakes, famine, severed trade networks, and internal revolts tearing apart civilizations that depended on each other, the way organs depend on a shared bloodstream. The Sea Peoples were part of that storm, not the whole weather system. Klein called them victims of the collapse as much as anyone else, refugees fleeing their own collapsing homelands. A 2019 study went further and found that of 148 archaeological sites with 153 destruction events pinned to this period, 94 of them, 61%, had been misdated, assumed on thin evidence, or simply never happened at all. The grand narrative of coordinated invasion was built partly on sloppy archaeology. What we can say is that Ramesses III fought them and won, twice. The Battle of Jahi on land, somewhere in what is now southern Lebanon, and then the Battle of the Delta on water, one of the first recorded naval engagements in history. Ramesses built a fleet for it, hid his ships in the mouth of the Nile, posted coast watchers to track the approaching enemy, and lined the river banks with archers. When the Sea Peoples sailed into the narrow channels, arrows poured into their ships from both sides, while the Egyptian fleet closed behind them. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show one detail that probably decided it. The Sea Peoples' ships had no oars. They relied entirely on sails. The Egyptian ships had both sails and oars, which meant they could maneuver in tight water while the enemy drifted. The Sea Peoples' boats were overturned. Men were dragged to shore and killed. After that, the Peleset settled the coast of Canaan and became the people the Bible calls Philistines. DNA from archaeological sites confirms they came from somewhere in the northeastern Mediterranean, likely the Aegean. The others scattered. And we are left with a mystery that 150 years of scholarship has not solved. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what drove them to cross the Mediterranean in boats with no oars? Fast forward 1,000 years and piracy has become something different, something almost respectable. In Homer's world, around 750 to 700 BC, piracy was not a crime. It was barely distinguishable from warfare. Odysseus himself sacks the Thracian city of Ismaros in Book 9 of the Odyssey, carrying off loot and women, and this is presented as heroic. When a stranger showed up at your shore, The normal greeting was to ask, "Are you a trader or are you a pirate?" This was not an insult. It was a professional inquiry, like asking someone if they are in sales or consulting. The ancient Greeks had two words for pirate, listes, and the later pirates, from which we get our word. Piracy in the archaic Greek world was aristocratic activity. Heroes raided coastal settlements the way medieval knights jousted. The transition from piracy as honorable raiding to piracy as crime is itself a story about how civilizations build legal systems, and it took centuries. The Romans had to learn that lesson the hard way. In 167 BC, Rome declared the island of Delos a duty-free port to undercut the trade monopoly of Rhodes. It worked. Rhodes lost its revenue, and because Rhodes could no longer afford its anti-piracy naval patrols, pirates flooded the vacuum. Delos became the center of the Mediterranean slave market. At its peak, according to the geographer Strabo, 10,000 slaves passed through Delos in a single day. The Cilician pirates operating from the craggy coves of what is now southwestern Turkey were Rome's primary suppliers. Rome tolerated them because Rome needed slaves. It was an economy feeding on its own disease. By the 60s BC, it had gotten out of hand. The Cilician pirates had over 1,000 ships. They raided the Italian coast directly, attacked Rome's own port of Ostia, kidnapped Roman officials, and, worst of all, intercepted Rome's grain fleet. Wheat prices spiked. The city faced genuine famine. So in 67 BC, the tribune Aulus Gabinius pushed through an extraordinary law, the Lex Gabinia, granting Pompey proconsular authority over the entire Mediterranean coastline, hundreds of warships, over 100,000 soldiers, and a massive treasury. The Senate hated it. This was an unheard of concentration of power. But the people were hungry, and grain prices reportedly dropped the same day the law passed, just on the expectation that Pompey would fix things. He did. Pompey divided the Mediterranean into 13 operational zones, each assigned to a commander. He swept the Western Sea first, securing Sicily, North Africa, and Sardinia, the three grain sources that fed Rome, in about 40 days. Then he pushed east zone by zone, compressing the pirates into their home waters off Cilicia, where a final battle at Corcysium finished them. The whole campaign took about 3 months. Then Pompey did something nobody expected. Instead of crucifying the 20,000 captured pirates, which was standard Roman policy, he resettled them. He moved them inland to underpopulated agricultural areas at Dyme, Soli, Malus, Adana, and elsewhere, gave them farmland, and bet that if they had a real livelihood far from the coast, they would never go back to sea. He was right, and the political precedent of handing one man that much military authority contributed directly to the collapse of the Roman Republic within a generation. Julius Caesar had his own pirate story, 25 years old, sailing to Rhodes in 75 BC to study public speaking, when Cilician pirates grabbed his ship near the island of Pharmacusa. They demanded 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed and told them to make it 50, because he was worth more. During 38 days of captivity, he ordered them to shut up when he wanted to sleep, read them his poems, and berated them for not appreciating his work, and told them repeatedly to their faces that when he got free, he would hunt them down and crucify every one of them. They thought it was bravado. After his associates paid the ransom, Caesar went to Miletus, raised a fleet despite holding no military authority whatsoever, sailed back to Pharmacusa where the pirates were still anchored because they had not bothered to move, captured them, reclaimed his 50 talents and crucified them all. In what he considered mercy, since they had been decent hosts, he had their throats cut before nailing them up. This comes from Plutarch and Suetonius, both writing decades later, so some embellishment is likely, but the core of the story is generally accepted by historians. Now jump 13 centuries. June 8, 793 AD. Vikings land on Lindisfarne, a monastery island off the northeast coast of England, one of the most important centers of Christian learning in northern Europe. The monks had no defenses. The raiders killed some, drowned others in the sea, and carried the rest off as slaves. Alcuin of York, the foremost Anglo-Saxon scholar of the age, then serving at Charlemagne's court, wrote in anguished letters that the Church of St. Cuthbert was spattered with the blood of the priests of God, and that never before had such terror appeared in Britain. He interpreted it as divine punishment for sin, and he warned it was the beginning of greater tribulation. He was right about that part. There had been an earlier incident, 3 ships of Northmen at Portland in 787 who killed a local official who went down to greet them. But Lindisfarne was the first strike on a major target, and it opened 2.5 centuries of Viking expansion that reached from Newfoundland to Baghdad. The Old Norse word Vikingeyjar may come from vik, meaning inlet or bay, suggesting someone who lurks in inlets waiting to pounce. But Vikings were never just pirates. The same crew might trade peacefully at one harbor and raid the next. They were traders, settlers, explorers, and looters, often on the same voyage. The Varangian Guard is a perfect example of this fluidity. In 988 AD, Emperor Basil II of Byzantium asked Vladimir I of Kiev for military help against a rebellion. Vladimir sent 6,000 Norse warriors. His motivation was partly self-interested. These were his most unruly fighters, and he could not afford to pay them. Getting them out of Kiev solved a domestic headache. In exchange, Vladimir received Basil's sister Anna in marriage and agreed to convert to Christianity, one of history's most consequential diplomatic deals. The Varangians became the emperor's personal bodyguard, and someone named Halfdan, bored during a church service in Hagia Sophia sometime in the next few centuries, carved runic graffiti into a marble balustrade. It reads, "Halfdan was here." It is still visible. Vikings raided far beyond England and France. In 844, a fleet sailed up the Guadalquivir and sacked Seville, then a flourishing city in the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba. The emirate was so shaken it built a permanent navy in response. The Arabic sources called the Vikings Majus, meaning fire worshippers. Swedish Vikings, the Rus, traveled down Russian rivers to the Caspian Sea, attacked Muslim cities in Persia, and traded furs, slaves, and amber for Arabic silver dirhams. Thousands of those coins have turned up in Scandinavian archaeological sites. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Wokou were tearing through the coastlines of Korea and China. The name means Japanese pirates, and for the first wave, from the 13th through the 14th centuries, that label was mostly accurate. Impoverished residents of Sushma and Iki turned to raiding after the chaos of the Mongol invasions. Between 1376 and 1385, 174 pirate raids hit Korea alone. Some involved bands of 3,000 men pushing deep into the interior, looting the capital of Gaeseong, reaching as far north as Pyongyang. The crisis contributed directly to the fall of the Goryeo dynasty in 1392, and it pushed Korea into developing gunpowder weapons, founding the Office of Gunpowder Weapons in 1377. The second wave in the 1550s and 1560s had a nasty twist. Despite the name, most of the pirates were not Japanese. The official history of Ming says that in a documented 1555 raiding party, only 30% were ethnic Japanese. 70% were Han Chinese. The driver was the Ming dynasty's Haijin, a trade ban that restricted all naval commerce to imperial channels. Coastal merchants whose businesses were made illegal overnight had two choices: go broke or go offshore. A sole trader named Wang Zhi chose the second option, and became the dominant pirate lord of the era, commanding fleets from the Goto Islands of Japan, styling himself the King of Hii. He was also accidentally the person who introduced firearms to Japan. In 1543, a junk belonging to Wang Zhi, carrying Portuguese traders, shipwrecked at Tanegashima. The local lord bought 2 matchlock muskets. Within years, Japan was mass-producing guns that decided the wars of unification. Wang Zhi eventually tried to negotiate amnesty and repeal of the Haijin. He surrendered under promises of clemency. The promises were lies. He was executed around 1559. The irony, after the crisis subsided, the Ming did relax the Haijin in 1567, conceding the exact point Wang Zhi had been making through violence. In the 1390s, the Baltic Sea had its own pirate crisis. The Victual brothers started as hired privateers, commissioned by the Dukes of Mecklenburg to break a Danish blockade of Stockholm in 1392. Their name came from the Latin victualia, provisions, because their original job was literally to deliver food. Having broken the blockade and discovered the profits of maritime violence, they never went home. By 1394, they had conquered the island of Gotland, sacked the city of Bergen, and maritime trade in the Baltic had virtually collapsed. The Hanseatic League and the Teutonic Knights eventually drove them from Gotland in 1398, but the survivors rebranded themselves as the like dealers, Low German for equal sharers, because they divided their plunder equally among all crew. This matters. Their egalitarian distribution of loot predates the famous pirate democracy of the Caribbean by nearly 300 years. Their most famous captain, Klaus Stortebeker, whose name translates roughly to down the beakerful, because he could allegedly drain a 4-liter jug of beer in one go, was captured and brought to Hamburg for trial. Before his execution on October 20th, 1401, he reportedly asked the mayor to release as many of his crewmates as he could walk past after being beheaded. The deal was accepted. According to legend, the headless body stood up, walked past 11 men, and only stopped when the executioner stuck out his foot and tripped it. The authorities then executed all 70 captured pirates anyway. A skull impaled on a nail, long believed to be his, sits in the Hamburg Museum of History to this day. In the Mediterranean, meanwhile, 2 mirror-image piracy systems were grinding against each other. On the North African coast, the Barbary corsairs raided Christian shipping with the endorsement of Ottoman authorities. On Malta and Rhodes, the Knights of St. John ran their own campaign, the Corso, against Muslim shipping, with the blessing of the Pope. Both sides took slaves, both sides collected ransoms, both sides dressed it up in religious language. The Knights of Malta were, in economic terms, a corsairing state whose revenue depended on piracy, slavery, and ransom payments, the same revenue model as the Barbary states they claimed to oppose. The Barbarossa brothers took this system to its maximum. Born on the island of Lesbos to a converted Muslim soldier and a Greek Christian woman, Arouj and Khizr built a pirate empire that conquered Algiers. In August 1512, during a battle at Bougie, a cannonball took Arouj's left arm. He was fitted with a silver prosthetic. A one-armed pirate with a silver arm conquering a kingdom is better than anything fiction ever produced. Arouj died fighting the Spanish at Tlemcen in 1518. They cut off his head, preserved it in a bag of honey, and shipped it to Spain. His brother Khizr, who took the name Hayreddin Barbarossa, then did something no pirate has done before or since. He became Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy. In 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, outnumbered nearly 3-1, he destroyed or captured 46 Christian ships without losing a single vessel. Ottoman naval dominance in the eastern Mediterranean lasted 33 years. The Barbary corsairs raided astonishingly far north. In 1627, ships from Algiers and sailed 3,000 miles to Iceland and kidnapped about 400 people. In 1631, the Dutch renegade Jan Janzoon, who had converted to Islam and renamed himself Murat Reis, led a raiding party to the village of Baltimore in County Cork, Ireland. An Irish fisherman named John Hackett guided them in. At least 107 villagers were taken to Algiers. Only 2 or 3 ever returned. Baltimore was virtually deserted for generations afterward. Hackett was hanged from the cliff above the village for his treachery. Between 1530 and 1780, the historian Robert Davis estimates that somewhere between 1 million and 1.25 million Europeans were enslaved by North African corsairs, though some scholars consider that figure too high. Now, about that golden age everyone fixates on. Most documentaries skip the origin, which is a mistake, because the origin is stranger than what followed. In 1605, King Philip III of Spain ordered Governor Antonio de Osorio to forcibly depopulate western and northern Hispaniola to stop smuggling. 159 soldiers burned sugar plantations, destroyed homes and churches, and forced relocations. It backfired catastrophically. The depopulated areas were occupied by French, English, and Dutch adventurers. Livestock that had been abandoned went feral and multiplied into enormous herds. French hunters adopted a Taino smoking technique called the boucan to cure the meat of these feral animals, which made them Buccaneers, which English colonists mangled into Buccaneers. The word has nothing to do with piracy, it means someone who smokes jerky. These men were hunters, not robbers. When Spain then tried to kill both the Buccaneers and the animals they depended on, they destroyed the only honest livelihood these people had, and the Buccaneers turned to the sea. Tortuga became their base from the 1630s onward, and the rest followed. The War of Spanish Succession ended in 1713, and the Treaty of Utrecht dumped thousands of trained privateers into unemployment with no pensions, no jobs, and one skill: naval combat. Nassau on New Providence Island had been destroyed by a Spanish-French force in 1702, and Britain never bothered to rebuild its government there. For over a decade, the island had no fort, no garrison, no law. Trade routes were fat with Spanish treasure ships, sugar, tobacco, rum, and slaves. Corrupt colonial governors looked the other way. It was, for a brief window, a perfect environment for piracy. Everything you think you know about pirates from this era was invented by one Scottish novelist and one English actor. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island in 1883 gave us treasure maps marked with an X, buried treasure, parrots on shoulders, and peg-legged pirates. His stepson Lloyd Osborne was painting a map of an imaginary island. Stevenson looked over his shoulder, started elaborating, and the entire novel grew from that single moment. There is no tradition of treasure maps before Stevenson. In reality, pirates divided their loot immediately and blew it on alcohol and gambling within days. Only one pirate in all of history is confirmed to have buried treasure: Captain Kidd, who in 1699 had Jonathan Gardiner bury Acacia on Gardiner's Island between Long Island's Twin Forks. British authorities dug it up shortly after Kidd's arrest. The pirate accent is even more recent. Every single element of it, the R, the rolling R's, the me hearties, was invented by the actor Robert Newton in Disney's 1950 Treasure Island. Newton was from Dorset in England's West Country. He simply exaggerated his own regional accent. People from that part of England do emphasize their R's and do say R in place of yes. Real pirates came from everywhere: England, Scotland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Africa, the colonies. There was no single pirate accent. Walking the plank, no documented instance during the entire Golden Age. Zero. If pirates wanted you dead, they threw you overboard, or marooned you on an island with a single-shot pistol. No theatre required. The real Golden Age was both more brutal and more interesting than the fiction. In September 1695, Henry Ivory attacked the Mughal treasure ship Ganj-i-Sawai in the Indian Ocean. The ship carried over 60 guns and more than 1,000 people, but one of its own cannons exploded during the opening volley, and Ivory's crew of 113 men boarded and took it. The loot was worth between 325,000 and 600,000 pounds, the richest pirate prize ever taken. Emperor Aurangzeb was so furious he closed 5 major English trade ports, imprisoned East India Company officials, and nearly destroyed English commerce in India entirely. Parliament declared every an enemy of all mankind and launched the first global manhunt in history. He was never caught. One of the very few pirate captains to escape with his fortune, and nobody knows what happened to him. Blackbeard, born Edward Thatch from Bristol, had a pirate career that lasted exactly 15 months. He tied slow-burning hemp fuses soaked in saltpeter into his enormous beard and lit them before battle, wreathing his face in smoke and making himself look like something from a nightmare. It was calculated a terrifying reputation meant most ships surrendered without a fight, which reduced casualties and kept the crew intact. When he blockaded Charleston in May 1718, his ransom demand was not gold, it was a chest of medicine. Archaeologists on the wreck of his flagship Queen Anne's Revenge, discovered in 1996 off Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, found a pewter urethral syringe containing traces of mercury, the standard treatment for syphilis. The crew had practical concerns. Blackbeard died on November 22, 1718, in the shallows off Ocracoke Island. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy laid a trap, ordering his men below decks, so the ship looked deserted. Blackbeard boarded, the hidden sailors surged up, and a close-quarters brawl erupted. Blackbeard snapped Maynard's sword blade. A Scottish Highlander slashed Blackbeard's neck from behind. When the body was examined, it showed 5 gunshot wounds and about 20 cutlass wounds. He was still trying to cock a pistol when he collapsed. Maynard cut off the head and hung it from the bowsprit. The body went into the water. Bartholomew Roberts, called Blackbeard only in a poem written long after his death, was the most successful pirate by every measure that matters. He captured over 400 ships in barely 3 years. He preferred tea to rum. He dressed in a crimson damask waistcoat with a red feather in his hat and a gold chain with a diamond cross. His crew had lights out at 8 p.m., musicians got the Sabbath off, and his articles of agreement included compensation for injuries, 800 pieces of eight for a lost limb, 100 for an eye. This predated any formal workers' compensation law by centuries. On February 10, 1722, HMS Swallow caught his fleet off Cape Lopez, Gabon. His crew was hung over. Roberts dressed in his finest clothes for battle. A blast of grape shot struck him in the throat and killed him almost instantly. His crew wrapped his body in his ship's sail and threw it overboard, his standing wish. The body was never found. The trial of Roberts' crew was the largest pirate trial in history. Of 272 captured pirates, 54 were condemned to death. 65 formerly enslaved Africans, whom Roberts had freed, were sold back into slavery. Captain Ogle was knighted, the only Royal Navy officer ever knighted solely for defeating pirates. Pirate governance was genuinely ahead of his time. Captains were elected by majority vote and could be deposed at any time. The quartermaster was separately elected and held equal authority outside of combat. Written articles of agreement functioned as constitutions. An estimated 25 to 30% of the roughly 5,000 Golden Age pirates were formerly enslaved black men or people of color. On some ships they could vote, carry weapons, and receive equal shares of plunder. The gap between pirate democracy and legitimate society was embarrassing. pirate crew members earned equal shares with only slight premiums for officers. Royal Navy captains received dozens of times what ordinary seamen earned, and that pay was routinely withheld for months. No wonder captured sailors volunteered to join pirate crews. Marcus Rediker, in Villains of All Nations, frames the whole era as proto-industrial workers fleeing a floating factory system. It is hard to argue with him. Anne Bonny and Mary Read sailed with Calico Jack Rackham in 1720, and their story ends with one of the most damning scenes in pirate history. When Jonathan Barnes' ship surprised them off, Point Negril, Jamaica, Rackham and the male crew were below decks, drunk. Only Anne, Mary and one other person fought back. Mary Read fired her pistols down into the hold, cursing the men cowering below. When Anne was allowed to see Rackham before his hanging, she told him she was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. Mary Read died of fever in prison in April 1721. Anne Bonny disappears from the historical record entirely. No execution was recorded. One theory holds that her wealthy father arranged her release, that she married a man named Joseph Burleigh, had 8 children, and died at 84. But primary sources do not confirm it. She simply vanishes. Half a world away, the most successful pirate in history was building something no European pirate ever approached. Zheng Yi Sao, born Shi Yang around 1775 in Guangdong province, married the pirate leader Zheng Yi in 1801. Together they assembled a confederation of 6 color-coded fleets with over 400 ships under direct command, part of a broader network of up to 1,800 vessels and 70 to 80,000 pirates. The entire Royal Navy at the time had about 1,000 ships. Blackbeard had 4. After Zheng Yi died in a storm in 1807, she secured power through an alliance with Zhang Bao, her husband's adopted son, and ran the operation herself. Zhang Bao altered a code of conduct stricter than most contemporary navies. Unauthorized shore leave meant your ears cut off and then execution. Stealing from the communal fund meant death. Raping a captive meant death. In 1808 and 1809, her forces destroyed Chinese imperial fleets and fought Portuguese warships from Macau to a standstill. Then she did what no other famous pirate managed. She negotiated her own retirement. On April 17, 1810, she walked into the government offices in Guangzhou with a delegation of 17 women and children and dictated terms. She surrendered 226 ships, 1,315 cannons, and 17,318 pirates. She kept 24 ships and 1,433 pirates for herself. Zhang Bao received a commission in the Imperial Navy. She received permission to marry him and a grant of land in Canton, where she opened a gambling house. She lived another 34 years as a wealthy businesswoman and died around age 69. Compare that to every other famous pirate. Blackbeard killed in combat, Kidd hanged, Roberts killed by grape shot, and Bonny imprisoned. Nobody else got out clean. While all of this was happening, the young United States was paying tribute to the Barbary states. By 1800, those payments consumed 20% of annual government revenue. In 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground near Tripoli and was captured with its entire crew. A 25-year-old lieutenant named Stephen Decatur led 74 volunteers into Tripoli harbor at night, boarded the Philadelphia, killed the entire enemy crew without losing a single American, burned the ship, and escaped under fire from shore batteries. Lord Nelson reportedly called it the most bold and daring act of the age. 2 years later, a force of 8 Marines and about 400 Arab and Greek mercenaries marched 500 miles across the Libyan desert and captured the city of Derna. It was the first time the American flag was raised on foreign soil in battle, and it is the reason the Marines' hymn mentions the shores of Tripoli. The ceremonial sword that Marine officers carry to this day is modelled on the Mameluke blade presented to Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon after that fight. The Barbary Wars ended in 1815 when Stephen Decatur, now a Commodore, sailed into the Algiers harbour, captured 2 Algerian warships in 3 days, and dictated terms. Tribute payments ended permanently. The British-Dutch bombardment of Algiers in 1816 freed the last European slaves, and the French conquest of Algeria in 1830 finally shut the whole system down. Piracy never stopped. It relocated. Somalia's central government collapsed in 1991, leaving over 2,000 miles of coastline unprotected. Foreign fishing fleets from Europe and Asia moved in and stripped the waters clean. Coastal communities lost their primary livelihood. The first Somali pirate groups called themselves the National Volunteer Coast Guard and the Somali Marines, and they started by trying to run off the trawlers. By 2010, Somali piracy was netting over $150 million a year in ransoms. Total ransoms between 2005 and 2012 exceeded $400 million. In the town of Haradire, pirates opened an actual stock exchange where locals could invest cash, weapons or equipment in upcoming operations. One woman reportedly contributed a $75 RPG launcher and received $75,000 in return. Modern pirates use motherships, GPS, satellite phones, and the automated identification system that ships are legally required to broadcast, tracking targets by name, position, course, and speed. The International Maritime Bureau recorded 90 incidents in the first half of 2025 alone, a near 50% increase year over year. Seafarers taken hostage tripled from 41 in 2022 to 126 in 2024. The most lasting thing pirates gave us is not a flag or an accent. The concept of universal jurisdiction, the legal principle that any nation can capture and try a pirate regardless of where the crime happened, was the first such principle in international law. Cicero coined the phrase hostis humani generis, enemy of all mankind, in 44 BC. That legal concept was later applied to slave traders in the 1800s, to torturers in 1980 in the Filartiga case, to perpetrators of genocide after World War II, and to transnational terrorists today. Every human rights prosecution under universal jurisdiction traces its legal ancestry directly back to piracy law. The modern insurance industry exists because London merchants in the 1680s pooled their money at Edward Lloyd's coffee house near the Thames to share the risk of pirate attacks, and that arrangement became Lloyd's of London. 3,000 years of piracy and its deepest fingerprints are on insurance contracts and war crimes. Tribunals. Not bad for a profession whose most famous accent was made up by a guy from Dorset in 1950.